Take two. This is one of those kind of complicated ones that I set myself up with where I go, hey, let's do something fun, and then this happens. Um, so when you look at Stanley Cup playoffs and then you look at the finals, and right now we're looking at this as our final. And everybody sort of agrees we didn't see this coming. But there's a lot of Stanley Cup finals we don't see coming, and I think that's part of what makes hockey a lot of fun to watch because there are a lot of underdog stories in the playoffs that come out. And right now we've got Washington and Vegas, and neither of them have a Stanley Cup to their name. Vegas, obviously, in their first year, in Washington, the only time they even show up in the finals is here, and that wasn't expected either. So let's go through, and I only went back to 1981, the year that I watched my first Stanley Cup final, which was Minnesota and the Islanders, and of course Minnesota got crushed because the Islanders were best dynasty I ever saw. I would honestly put them ahead of the Oilers dynasty. The Oilers dynasty had a couple of baubles along the way. The Islanders, it was four straight Stanley Cups, and then they go to the final that fifth year. They were insane. The but in '81, Minnesota was ninth overall, and they were an underdog. And what it did was it set the bar up here, and they could never get back there again. Same with the '82 Canucks, who were second in the Smythe. They had home ice in every series until the final because top dogs kept getting knocked out, but they were 11th overall, and in the finals they were exposed as not being in that same category. But I will say there was limited blowouts in that series. It might have been a four-game sweep, but Vancouver kept the score close in game one. Um, and then the Oilers came in, and nobody was surprised to see the Oilers, the Islanders, and then the Flyers get back into the final in '85, which didn't really surprise anybody either. '86, Calgary and Montreal kind of surprised people because Montreal had Patrick Roy, who was a rookie goaltender at the time, and Calgary would have to go through Edmonton, of course. If not for Steve Smith and the incident that took place, Edmonton could have won five straight Stanley Cups. Absolutely could have. And that would be one hell of an impressive run. It's an impressive run with five cups in 7 years, but 6 out of 7, boy, I tell you. Anyways, Calgary wins that series, and they go on to play Montreal in a matchup of underdogs of a sort. Even though Montreal was only 10 years removed from being a dynasty, um, Pittsburgh, Boston, Montreal, Calgary, Edmonton. None of these are really entirely surprising. In 1990, it's a bit of a surprise to see Edmonton back in there. They're fifth overall. Boston was number one overall that year with 101 points, just showing just how many extra points are being doled out in the NHL now. Edmonton, this was after the Gretzky trade. That was a surprise to see them back in the final and win it. Pittsburgh's first Stanley Cup was a surprise. It was a surprise because going into those playoffs, nobody thought they could play defense. That's all you heard about. There's no defense, and Barasso's not a great goaltender. Barasso played really well. Their defense was good enough, and they got that Stanley Cup over the number 16 seeded Minnesota. So Pittsburgh's number 7, Minnesota's number 16, and Minnesota goes on that insane run to get there. Pittsburgh and Chicago. Again, Pittsburgh was a surprise because due to the passing of Bob Johnson, Scotty Bowman takes over, and there was some um, obviously turmoil associated with switching coaches, even though you're going to Scotty Bowman, who's the greatest coach I ever saw. But they overcame that and they won. They were sixth overall. They were third in the Patrick, which shows just how deep the Patrick was at the time. Chicago was eighth overall. Nobody was picking them to go to the finals going into that playoffs, and they made it. Montreal and LA. Montreal, 6th overall. LA, 11th overall. LA, I qualify as a huge underdog there. Nobody expected that run into them. Montreal, honestly, because Patrick Roy reasons, it wasn't a huge surprise to me. The 10 overtime wins, that was impressive, but that's Patrick Roy. Rangers and Vancouver. I don't need to say Islanders. I'm not going to have to say them again. Rangers and Vancouver. So Vancouver goes to the finals and they run into the New York team again. And this time Vancouver was 14th overall. So as much of an underdog story as '82 was, '94 they were even lower in the standings. So something to consider when you look at greatest and biggest underdog stories. Vancouver was really up against it. New Jersey, with their first Stanley Cup, the green asterisks are for the first Stanley Cups. They defeat the supposed to be great Detroit Red Wings. New Jersey was ninth overall that year. 2006, Colorado wins their first Stanley Cup, and that's when the Battle of Detroit and Colorado really got going. Um, and in the finals, Colorado beat Florida. This was a sweep. Florida was unexpected. They were seventh overall, third in the Atlantic. Not a huge surprise to see Detroit and Philly in the finals the following year. Philly, of course, with Eric Lindros. Then Detroit beats Washington the following year. Washington was eighth overall. They were third in the Atlantic, and Washington had that choking reputation that they were always losing in the playoffs when they should win. This was a season they were underdogs and they won. It's funny how that works, but they ended up running into a Detroit team in the final. They just couldn't solve. Dallas wins their first and only Stanley Cup in a final against the Buffalo Sabres, who were fourth in the Northeast but ninth overall. So the Northeast Division was tough that year. New Jersey and Dallas the year after, then Colorado, New Jersey, and it was at this point where I talked with friends of mine about how Detroit, Colorado, and New Jersey were hoarding the cup, and so you didn't have a dynasty in here, but you kind of did because you had the same three teams winning the Stanley Cup, and I think that's as close as we're going to get to dynasties in this modern age. Dynasties, 3 Stanley Cup wins in 4 years. I think we're going to talk about multiple teams being the dominant ones. So the era of Colorado, Detroit, and New Jersey. And New Jersey continued that in 2003 when they overcame the 11th place Anaheim. A year after, Detroit overcame 16th place Carolina. Now, the red asterisks are for years that 2 first place in their division teams meet in the final. You'll notice there's a red one right next to this because Carolina was first in the Southeast, but they were 16th overall. The Southeast Division was not a very good division. And the fact that one team from every division had to make the playoffs drove people insane because it was believed that Carolina shouldn't be anywhere near the playoffs. And yet here they were. As a division winner, you get a top 3 seed. So they were the number 3 seed in the East, even though they were the number 16 team overall, and controversy. And they got to the finals. 2004, Tampa over Calgary. This is Tampa's only Stanley Cup to date. Calgary, 12th overall. 2006, so coming out of the lockout, both of these teams were not expected to be there. Carolina wins their first and only Stanley Cup over the Oilers. Carolina was 4th overall. Edmonton was 14th overall, but Carolina didn't have anybody picking them to go to the finals. Nobody picked them. And again, it's the Southeast Division. So even though they had a good point total, people were like, yeah, but look who they played. It doesn't really matter. It mattered in the playoffs. They won the cup. 2007, Anaheim wins their only Stanley Cup over the Ottawa Senators. The Ottawa Senators were 9th overall. I was not surprised by Anaheim winning the cup that year at all. When they added Pronger, I knew that was going to happen. 2008, Detroit and Pittsburgh, both first-place teams. 2009, no surprise that they had a rematch. That was fantastic. That was great. 2010, Chicago and Philly. Philly was 18th overall. So when people talk about going back to the conference format, which is 1 versus 8, 2 versus 7, it doesn't mean you're going to have a playoffs that people all agree on. They were 18th overall and went to the finals, and they were the number 7 seed in the East. Montreal was 19th overall, and they made the playoffs. Out west, St. Louis and Anaheim had more points, didn't make the playoffs. The cutoff in the West for the playoffs was 95. The cutoff in the East was 88. So Philly goes to the finals, and they lose a 6-game series against Chicago, which was a weird series in that the finals just sort of ended, and it was like nobody knew except the guy who scored the goal. 2011, Boston was 7th overall, and that's not really remembered. The series between Boston and Vancouver, there's other things that are remembered. That's not it. And Boston was an underdog, but they were still a division leader that year. 2012, this was the big underdog year. LA's 13th overall and New Jersey's 8th overall. So as surprising as this result is, I would still say if I had to pick a finals that was most surprising, it'd be either of the LA finals. 2012, they're 3rd in the Pacific. New Jersey's 4th in the Atlantic, and they meet in the finals. This is, of course, the last hurrah for Marty Brodeur. 2013, Chicago and Boston. Not a huge surprise to see Chicago in there. 2014, LA and the New York Rangers. As I said, big underdog stories there. LA's 10th overall, the Rangers 12th. And it was unusual to see the two of them in the finals, and It was an unusual final, and why not? LA comes out on top. It was close. That's how it works. 2015, Chicago was a surprise. They were third in the Central, seventh overall. And coming into the 2015 playoffs, there was some belief that, Chicago's probably had their last run. And then once the playoffs started, they were Chicago and nobody was knocking them out. The finals between Chicago and Tampa, that's one of the more entertaining finals I've ever watched. Pittsburgh and San Jose. San Jose was 11th overall in the NHL. And of course, last year we had Pittsburgh and Nashville. Nashville was 17th overall in the standings. They actually had less points than Tampa, who missed the playoffs last year. So, yes, this year's final is surprising. This year's final is one that we would not have predicted. But in the grand scheme of things, if you have to pick the most surprising finals ever, I'd go with either LA and New Jersey, LA and the New York Rangers, and this has to be both teams, not just one. Carolina and Edmonton, and I'll go with Pittsburgh and Minnesota. And yeah, so those are the four I think most surprising finals out of all the ones that I've been able to witness. Let me know which one you think is the most surprising finals since 1981, and yeah, you can pick that one if you want. But really, I think we're blinded by the fact that these guys had a reputation coming into these playoffs for losing big games, and we were blinded by the fact this was their first year, and first-year teams shouldn't do anything, right? So a lot of green on this, meaning that teams do win their first Stanley Cups. It does happen, and this year, one of these teams will win their first. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Do not forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon.